And without further ado, big round of applause for Neil.
Cool. Thank you very much. Good evening, everybody. My name's Neil. I've been working in digital product in a UX capacity for about 15 years. But tonight I'm going to talk to you about this passion project here, which is about developing a physical product. From the concept of discussing it in a pub at Waterloo Station on a Friday night to getting it into the hands of a customer. And I'll touch on just a few of the lessons that I learned along the way. So first of all, hands up, who's played paddle or padel? Okay, a few of you. Okay, so for those that haven't, so padel is born out of Mexico. It's a hybrid between, did I get a whoop? Fantastic. It's a hybrid between tennis and squash. As you can see here, it's typically played in doubles. And it's a fantastic, dynamic, fast-paced game, which most people can pick up in a relatively short space of time. I'm just going to hand this around. I'm going to pass it around to get a feel for that. So I started playing this game back in 2021, and I started to look for a racket. And I realised that the majority of the tennis brands had transitioned into the paddle space. So you had the Adidas's, the Babolats, the Slazengers, and they had these horrible names like Viper. I was thinking, none of these really appeal to me. I'm looking for something a little bit more refined, a little bit more kind of understated. And I thought, is there an opportunity to do something slightly different here? So I started to do some research. I looked at some private equity reports. I looked at the kind of the growth trajectory in the UK. I looked at planning applications. And at the time, there were over 100 applications for courts in the UK, and I thought, could equipment match that demand? So I started to speak to some suppliers. I spoke to some out in China, in Morocco, and quickly realised that the majority of these suppliers were looking for orders of thousands or tens of thousands at a time. And as a startup, that's just not realistic. So this brings me on to lesson number one. There were two things which I've taken away from this process, which I think are really important. The first is that you want to reduce risk when you're going on an initial order. So some people might look at unit price and compare that, but the reality is that you want to make sure that you're only ordering the minimum number of products you can validate with your target market. And also, especially if you're working with a European supplier, and mine was based out on the outskirts of Madrid, you need to make sure that you've got that relationship in place, because it turns out that most times things don't happen right straight away, and you need to have those open conversations with them. So just in terms of the product themselves, so hopefully you've all seen the racket now. So the racket or bat, if it's interchangeable, is made of 3 components. So on the outer shell, it's carbon fibre. On the inside, it's made of EVA foam, and that foam comes in different densities. So you've got the soft foam, and that's quite forgiving for the player. If it's a little bit harder, a little bit tougher, adds a bit more punch, a bit more power. And that's important. I'll come on to that in a second. The second lesson, in the true spirit of user-centered design, once you've got that prototype, it's so important to get feedback before you press that order. And in this context, it meant getting a dozen players who are semi-pro or strong amateur players to come down, test the rackets, how do they look, how do they feel, how do they play, and give some candid feedback to me. And the reason why, in this particular example, it was so important, you've got Jared here on the right, and at the time, he was the UK's number 11 paddle player, and him, and I think it was 4 or 5 others, said, if you're looking to target the market at that novice or entry level, you've got to be creating something a bit more forgiving. So going back to that, the composition of the racket, something to look out for. I was able to take that feedback and work with the supplier and then adjust that model. Lesson number 3, using brand ambassadors in in-person events. So I imagine most people in the room here are probably quite comfortable with the digital space. I, for one, having worked in that, I was quite comfortable setting up a Shopify site. I started to produce some content which was SEO optimized. I even started to work in the kind of the Instagram and LinkedIn kind of campaign space to try and target that prospect. But one thing that I really underestimated at the time was the power of offline marketing. And this is twofold. So The first thing is that brand ambassadors are key when you're a starter. You need people to become an extension of your brand. It's very hard doing this by yourself. And in this instance, I wanted to get some coaches on board who could use the products within lessons. And a lot of the coaches in the paddle space already had relationships with the big brands. So I was like, what can I do differently here? So I looked into tennis coaches transitioning to paddle that looking to create a name for themselves in that space. Took them out for dinner, took them out for drinks, sold what I was trying to achieve and whether they wanted to come on that journey as well. And they were fantastic when it came to the in-person events because you can see Dylan here, he was there, he was running some drills, and we did this time and time again over the UK. And we were able to bring people in new to the game. Their first interaction with padel was with Polesden, and therefore they remembered us. We got some fantastic social content, and we were able to use this on our social media. So I think, just to kind of clarify here, it's not always about digital marketing. We might be comfortable in that space, but get outside your comfort zone and look at these mediums. So lastly, lesson number 4. So run retrospectives. So I imagine most probably do this on a fortnightly or monthly basis. Get around the table, you have some candid discussions. When you're doing this by yourself, it's very easy to get wrapped up in the emotion of what you're trying to do. You're on a hamster wheel. It's like, what's next? What do I need to do next? What's the next challenge? And you very rarely take time out to reflect on what's gone well, what hasn't, and most importantly, what's the successes? Like, what have I achieved in the last kind of 2 to 4 weeks? And it's very easy to lose sight of that when you're working on a passion project. And just lastly, when it comes to the looking for mentorship and knowing what's maybe going as well, this was a great opportunity to go, well, at the time, I didn't really know much about performance marketing, how to kind of target people on Instagram. And there were kind of their key moments along the way where I was stagnating, and that just these kind of like moments of reflection every kind of 2 to 4 weeks were kind of just forced me into action to do something a bit different. So, plenty of time, 2.5 minutes.
Do a dance.
Could do a dance.
Or paddle illustration.
Paddle illustration, yeah. So I'm going to be around afterwards. So has anyone got any questions about Polesden or wants to chat padel? Yeah, hopefully that was useful. And if you're thinking about doing something similar in the future, you can take 1 or 2 of those nuggets away and apply them to your journey.
Ooh, yay.